Hello, I'm Robin. Welcome to Bookspin. Today I thought I'd try something a little different. I'm going to look back on all of the Hugo Award winning novels that I've read, and I'm going to rank these, and I'm going to give my brief opinion on each of them. So I think the Hugo Awards are quite interesting. I'm not someone who pays close attention to awards when it comes to deciding what to read. But I do think in the world of science fiction and fantasy, they are definitely among the most prestigious things that you can receive as an award. And they're a good indicator of a book's popularity and status within the genre. So it's definitely worth taking a look at some of these books. Now, if my calculations are correct, there have been 72 novels that have won this award since 1953, when they first started. And among those, I've only read 22, so it's not that many. But there are also a further 8 books in this category, which I haven't read yet, but I do really want to read, and I have copies on my bookshelf. So I've decided to include those books as well. So in total, but that's 30 books. And I've put them all together here in this platform. These 30 books in chronological order. So I'm going to briefly talk about each of them, and I'm going to put them in a category. I'm going to rank them. So for those books that I've read, I've got 3 or 4 different categories. So very briefly, we've got the top category, The Cat's Whiskers, which is a book which I absolutely loved and would happily reread, or I've already reread. A 5-star read, or 4.5 stars maybe. Underneath this, we've got a decent read, which would be a book which I liked, but not quite 5-star level. So this would be maybe 3 stars or 3.5 or 4 stars maybe. So there's the next category would be disappointing, which would be anything below that. 1 or 2 stars, average or poor. Then we have DNF, which is a book which I didn't finish, which is very rare because I nearly always finish a book once I've started reading it, even if I'm not particularly enjoying it. And the final category is TBR, which are those books, those 8 books, which I haven't read yet, but I'm planning to. So if you're watching this, perhaps you can help me decide among the TBR books which of those you'd recommend that I read sooner rather than later. Which ones should I prioritize, or are there any books which perhaps you don't recommend so much? So let's dive in. We've got these 30 books down here in chronological order, and the first book is A Case of Conscience by James Blish. I don't know a lot about this one, to be honest. I just know that it came out in the 1950s. It's a classic. I think it may have religion as a theme. That's about as much as I know. Last year I picked up a nice vintage paperback out in the wild, so it goes into the TBR. And the next book is A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller Jr., which again, similarly, is a 50s classic, which I haven't read yet. For this one, I have had some good things about it. It's got apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic themes. It's got religious themes. I've heard it's quite epic in scope. This is something that I really do want to read, so I'm going to also put that in my TBR. Okay, next one is Stranger in a Strange Land by Robert A. Heinlein. Now, this is actually a book which I'm reading at the moment. This is my copy here. Nice hardback. So yeah, I've not quite finished it yet. I've got about 100 pages to go, but it is quite a chunker, so I've read most of it already, so I think I can give my opinion now. I will be giving a full review at some point soon. But basically, for now, I'll just say I am enjoying it. And I'm not quite as enjoying it as perhaps I hoped I would. It started off really promising, and then it's starting to drag right a lot. I think it's a bit too long. There's that. There are a few other issues with it, which I'll talk about when I review it. So I'm going to put that as a decent read. But this book does have quite a big or important status within the history of the genre, because it's one of the first science fiction books to sort of break out into the mainstream. And it's often said to have had quite a big impact on the counterculture movement of the 1960s. So it's definitely a significant book. And the next one is Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, which I haven't read yet, and I feel pretty bad about that, because this is something which I'm sure I would enjoy. I don't really believe in using a term like list of shame, but if we are saying list of shame, this would probably be at the top of mine, or near the top of books I haven't read yet. I really enjoyed the Amazon TV series adaptation a few years ago, and it's Philip K. Dick, so you know it's going to be interesting. Classic alternate history, set in a world in which the Nazis and the Japanese won World War II. That comes high up in my TBR. Waystation by Clifford Simak. Haven't read it yet. I've got a nice vintage paperback which I found out in the wild up on my bookshelf. Don't know much about it, but Simak is a great writer, so I'd probably enjoy that. Dune by Frank Herbert. One of the most famous science fiction novels of all time. Now, actually, in all honesty, I didn't really enjoy it that much. I mean, I did enjoy it, but I think my expectations were perhaps too high based on the hype. I think the world building is second to none, and it's a great story, but I just couldn't really get on with Frank Herbert's writing style. I found his characters not particularly interesting, and the dialogue not very believable. So for me, there were some issues with Dune, which I know, for a lot of people, this is one of their favourite books, or if not their favourite science fiction novel ever. So I know this one is very popular, but I still enjoyed it, but it's not something I really want to go back to or continue the series with. So I'm going to go for a decent read for Dune. This Immortal by Roger Zelazny. Interesting thing about this book co-won the Hugo Award with Dune. I think the year was 1966, so they both shared the award in that year. But of course, This Immortal is a far less well-known book. I read this book last year and I really enjoyed it. I think Roger Zelazny has a great way with combining science fiction and fantasy. Science fantasy. I think he does science fantasy very well. This is a very creative and quite humorously written story which incorporates a lot of Greek mythological elements. So I actually really enjoyed This Immortal and would happily reread it, so I'm going to put that as my first Cat's Whiskers title. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, another Heinlein. This was the first Heinlein book that I read, and in all honesty, I didn't really enjoy it that much. It's got some great ideas. It's set on the moon, in a future in which the moon has been transformed into a penal colony, and it's got a kind of war of independence going on. where the moon is subservient to Earth. So it's a great idea, but Heinlein's writing, in this book, he kind of writes it in a kind of pseudo Russian English style, which I found pretty grating. And he has a particularly annoying habit of using his characters as to pontificate on his views on his politics, which I found kind of annoying. So I'm going to put this as disappointing. Another Zelazny, Lord of Night. Lord of Light was amazing. Absolutely love this book. Again, we've got science fantasy. We've got mythological elements. In this case, it's from Hindu and Buddhist mythology. This is a great novel. I'm going to put this next to This Immortal, Among the Cat's Whiskers. I really want to read more of Zelazny's works, and I'm planning to read his short story collection soon. But if there are any of Zelazny's works, especially his novels, because I don't know much else about his work which you would recommend, please let me know. And then we've got The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula K. Le Guin. Now, I'm a big fan of Le Guin's writing. I think she writes quite beautifully. She comes up with some great ideas. The Left Hand of Darkness, of course, has got some quite radical ideas about gender, and it's got an interesting kind of narrative going on a kind of winter world. I think the world itself is called Winter, isn't it? So this one, to be honest, when it took me a while to get into this book, but I did really enjoy it by the end. So I'm going to put this one as The Cat's Whiskers, actually. Larry Niven, Ringworld. I haven't read it yet. Don't know much about it, but I've got a vintage paperback which has been knocking around on my bookshelf for years, so I really ought to get around to it at some point. Philip Jose Farmer, To Your Scattered Bodies Go. One of my favourite books. Absolutely crazy premise, set in an afterlife, an artificially constructed afterlife. Some crazy characters based on real historical people. I really enjoyed this novel, and I went on to read the whole 5-book series, but I think the first book is definitely the best one, so that goes under the Cat's Whiskers. We're into the 1970s now, and we've got Arthur C. Clarke, Rendezvous with Rama, which I haven't read. I think I probably would enjoy. I just recently I really enjoyed 2001: A Space Odyssey. That was amazing, and I quite liked what's that other one? Childhood's End. Yeah, so I think I probably would enjoy that. The Dispossessed, Ursula K. Le Guin. That's a classic philosophical, political sci-fi story. I think I enjoyed that one even more than The Left Hand of Darkness, actually, so I'm going to put that up there. Kate Wilhelm, Where Late the Sweet Birds Sang. Don't know much about this one. I picked up a vintage copy out in the wild last year. I think it's got cloning as a theme, so I'm going to put that in there, TBR. Frederick Pohl, Gateway. So I read this one quite recently. I reviewed it on his channel. This one, I was a bit disappointed with. I did like some of the ideas in this novel. It's got a great premise, but the main character is so annoying, so obnoxious, that it kind of put me off the novel. So if you want to know more about that, you can look at my review. But I'm going to put this as disappointing. The Fountains of Paradise by Arthur C. Clarke. So I don't know much about this one. This is another TBR. This one, I think it involves a giant space elevator, and it's Arthur C. Clarke, so I'm sure it'll be good. Neuromancer by William Gibson. 1980s classic, the definitive cyberpunk novel. I read it years ago. I found it very confusing. I didn't really know what was going on, which kind of limited my enjoyment of it. But I do respect its place within the genre and the kind of the cultural impact it had on cyberpunk and the 1980s. And I think I probably would give it another chance, and I would like to reread this again at some point and read the rest of the Sprawl trilogy. So I'm going to put that as a decent read. Orson Scott Card, Ender's Game. This is another 80s classic. So this one, it's kind of... I did enjoy it. I think it's got all the ingredients for a good story, some great ideas, classic military sci-fi. It's a bit YA-ish for my liking. Basically, most of the protagonists are children who are being drafted into a military training program where they get trained to become the next generation of super soldiers to fight against an alien invasion. And it does have quite an interesting twist. But I did find the characters and the dialogue not very believable. I just don't think... the children, Ender and his peers, for a large part of the book, they're like 6 years old. But they don't really talk in the way that 6-year-olds do, or you expect them to do. But it's a decent read, so I'm going to put it here. Speaker for the Dead is the sequel to Ender's Game. It came out the following year. I actually really like this one. It's totally different, actually, to Ender's Game. It's set much later on. Ender is now an adult. You've got a very intriguing first contact scenario going on with a very interesting alien race and some quite deep philosophical themes. This is a top-notch read, so I'm going to put that among the cat's whiskers. Hyperion, one of my all-time favourites. The ultimate space opera. I mean, I don't think you can call any novel perfect, but this is pretty damn close to perfect, so that definitely goes up here. A Fire Upon the Deep. Again, this is another wonderful book. It contains all of the great ingredients for a great science fiction novel. You've got excellent world building, interesting characters, fascinating ideas, and some very intriguing alien species, some very creative alien species. So I absolutely loved A Fire Upon the Deep. Okay, now we're moving on to, I think this was around the year 2000, 2001, and we've got the first fantasy entry, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, which I think was the fourth book in the Harry Potter series. Now, I read this when it came out, so that was quite a long time ago, and at the time I really enjoyed the Harry Potter books. I probably wouldn't enjoy it that much now. It's not really something that would interest me now. So at the time, this would be a 5-star read. I was totally engrossed. But I think it would be more accurate, based on my current taste, to say this is a decent read. So I'm gonna leave it at that. And then we've got another fantasy, which is American Gods by Neil Gaiman. So this book, I actually loved American Gods. This is probably my all-time favorite fantasy novel. And I read this as a teenager. I've read it 3 times, and I would happily reread it again. So if you want to know more about this book, have a look at my video, my top 10 non-science fiction books, because I put this one at number 1. I made that video a few months ago. I'm going to put that up here. Spin by Robert Charles Wilson. I read just recently. So I enjoyed Spin. I think it's a cracking read. Great character building and some very interesting ideas. Not quite 5 stars for me, or 4.5 stars, but it's still a very good read, so I'm going to put it as a decent read here. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is another fantasy novel. It's a kind of Victorian fantasy. I read this when it came out. I don't remember much about it, to be honest. I was a teenager when I read it. Yeah, I remember it's a big doorstopper of a book, about 900 pages long. And I do remember it had these very long footnotes, which would sometimes spread over 2 or 3 pages. So I probably wouldn't read that again, but it's still a decent read. Another Neil Gaiman book, The Graveyard Book. And this is actually a children's book, or YA. I have read it, and I did enjoy it. And I would probably reread this. I might, yeah. I would. It's not science fiction, but it is Neil Gaiman. I'm not quite sure if I would put it next to American Gods. I don't think it's that good, so I'm going to put it here as a decent read. The Three-Body Problem. So, yes, I've read this one twice, and of course I've watched the recent Netflix series, so I'm pretty familiar with the story now. This is an interesting one. It's the first Hugo Award-winning novel which is translated from another language. So that's quite an important milestone, I think. I did enjoy it, but I don't think it's not the highlight of the series, of the trilogy. I would put the second and third books up at the top here, but this is not. I don't think it's quite on the same level as those 2 books, so I'm going to put it as a decent read. And we've got 2 books left, and these are both N.K. Jemisin. So the 5th season, which is kind of, I'm not really sure whether you could call it science fiction or fantasy. It kind of feels a bit more fantasy-ish to me. It's got some very interesting plot devices and world building. I actually quite enjoyed this. I'm not quite sure if it's a cat's whiskers, but I'm going to put it here as a decent read. And finally, we've got the sequel to the 5th season, which is called The Obelisk Gate. And for some reason, this book I never actually finished. I started reading it, then I got distracted, and it was a library book, so I had to return it back to the library before it's due, and I never got around to finishing it. And I kind of lost interest, to be honest. So I was kind of going through a phase in my life where I was transitioning from fantasy to science fiction as my main interest. So that's why I decided never to go back to that series. It doesn't mean it's bad or anything. It's just it's a DNF. Okay, and that completes the list. So let me know your thoughts on these books, and especially these TBR books. Which among these do you think I would enjoy the most? I think probably the one I most want to read is Philip K. Dick's The Man in the High Castle. So hopefully I can get around to that sometime later this year. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you again soon.